I have a simple and effective approach for handling behavioral interviews, and there are a couple keys to it. A behavioral interview is anything where somebody says, tell me about a time when. I want to hear your past experiences and your behaviors, and I'm going to use that as a proxy to predict how you would behave in this role. So they're looking at how you handled conflict, how you made decisions, how you worked with your team, how you met deadlines, how you handled stress, etc. So anything that starts with tell me about a time when is a behavioral interview. Amazon is really well known for using these extensively in the interview process. Many companies use them, many hiring managers use them. You may see it, you may not in a given interview, but they're quite common and they are important, so be ready for them. Here's the approach. First of all, there is a principle. Never tell a story that you have not practiced before. What happens the first time you tell a story? Somebody asks a question, and then you're thinking on the spot to try to come up with a situation. Tell me about a time when you had to lead a team and somebody wasn't pulling their weight and how you managed that situation. You're trying to think. A couple things happen. One, you may not pick the best situation. You may, after the interview, realize, you know what? I tried to pick something in 20 seconds under pressure, and I picked an example that was okay, but there was a much better example that would have made my leadership skills and my decision making and everything glow, and that one was only all right. So you may pick the wrong example. Another one is it takes you too long because you haven't rehearsed it, so you don't know exactly what the messages are that you're sending. You're working your way through the story in real time in front of the interviewer. That tends to have things drag on. You have to be really careful. It's easy to burn 5 minutes in an interview. You have really limited time and resources in an interview to make an impression. If you burn 5 minutes on the wrong topic and don't make a really strong impact on that, then that can be an issue. And then the other thing that happens is the words that come out of your mouth aren't the most poignant. You may make a point that later on you regret. And you say, you know what, I wish I hadn't said that. That didn't come across as I intended to. Or there was this really key leadership moment within that story that I forgot and I didn't tell. Or there are particular words that I said that I didn't want to say, or particular words I should have focused on that I didn't say. And so if you practice these ahead of time, you can avoid all of those problems. You can do it short and succinct and use your time well. You can have a great example and you can tell the story in an effective way. So how do you do this? You just come up with a very simple matrix. Do a Google search, come up with the top 12 behavioral interviews. It's very simple and they repeat themselves. They tend to look like, tell me about a time when you displayed leadership, or when you had a conflict, or when you needed to manage against a timeline and you were up against time pressure, etc. There's a handful of these. If you ever come across one that you hadn't seen before, you add it to your list, but you have a list. These are the questions. And then you think about your experiences. And in the columns, you put down your stories. Story 1, story 2, story 3, your juiciest stories from your career that you want to make sure that you talk about. And then for each story, you mark off which questions it could apply to, because many of these stories will apply to more than one. Some of them might apply to all of them, because frequently your most interesting leadership experiences cover a bunch of different situations and scenarios. Then you practice these stories. And I compare this to similar to how an American football team prepares. They will prepare 100 plays and practice them. They practice each play, they know the plays, and they know what they're called. And then during a game, a coach is improvising. What they see on the field is going to call them in the moment to call a play instantly. But they're never calling a play that the team hasn't practiced. So they won't use all 100 plays, but they will only use plays that they've practiced. So you can say play 7, you run play 7, and it goes well, or at least you gave yourself a really good opportunity for it to go well. Same thing in an interview. So prepare your stories, which is your playbook, and then understand what play works best in what situation. And during the interview, when somebody says, tell me about a time when, you're not thinking of your examples in real time. You know your examples, and you're just picking the best play for that moment. And make sure that you make an impression that you have a great story, you've rehearsed it, you know the words to say, the words to not say, and you can come across as somebody that has some really deep experience working with people and working with teams and delivering great results. Now let's talk about timing. One of the biggest issues during interviews is that the hiring manager has a limited slot of time. Let's say they're spending 30 minutes on behavioral interview questions because there's 15 minutes at the beginning when they're getting warmed up and 10 minutes at the end for you to ask questions. They have a couple other things they want to get to, and they have some really important behavioral interviews, and they have 30 minutes to do it within your slot. And they give you a question and it's not their most important one. And you spend 5, 7, 8 minutes answering that question, which is extraordinarily easy to do if you haven't rehearsed them. Now time got away from you because you're trying to think through it real time. You're trying to explain yourself, you're trying to think, and you're trying to be eloquent all at the same time on the spot. Meanwhile, the hiring manager is frustrated because they don't really understand what the point is and they just want to get to the next topic. So they either have to interrupt you or they burn time and they don't get to their most important ones, which is bad for you. So let's flip the script. How do you control the timing and let the hiring manager get to what they need to get to? I recommend practicing your stories and spending 30 to 60 seconds on the situation, 30 to 60 seconds on the action, and 30 to 60 seconds on the result. The situation is the setup. What was at stake? What were you up against? What was the scenario? Action. What were the courses of action that you considered? And what did you do and why? And the result. What was the impact? What was the outcome? It's harder to fit this in 60 seconds or less than you think. And if you put all three of those together, that's 3 minutes. That means that you can explain a story, it can pack a punch, and now the hiring manager can either move on because they want to get to other topics and they got your key message, they got your key result and it resonates, or if this is a really important deep topic and they want to dedicate time to it, they can ask follow-up questions and you can elaborate. But you've put it back in their core. You don't want to burn time in areas that they don't want, and you don't know where they want to spend time, so you have to be succinct. In-depth enough to get your message across, but succinct. Then they can go deeper or they can move on. Practice this for your stories. Keep each one to 3 minutes or less. Last piece of advice here is engage the interviewer. Being a hiring manager or recruiter is very repetitive, especially if you're hiring a lot or have been hiring over a long period of time. You have interview after interview after interview, hours and hours, weeks and weeks on end. And people tell the same types of stories. They have the same types of resumes. They have the same reasons for why they want the job. They ask you to tell them about your career and how you got there. And that's fair. And that is interesting for the job candidate. It's not interesting for the hiring manager because that story is always the same. And they repeat it again and again and again and again. So it's repetitive and it can frequently be boring. So as a candidate, if you come in and you tell a story that's really interesting and you teach them something and the hiring manager leaves that interview knowing something they didn't know before they started, that's fun for them. That's engaging. And so when you think about your stories, don't feel limited to things that are always really specifically product related at the surface level. There may be things that you did in other parts of your life that are actually quite relevant to this scenario, and always have work-related ones in case that's really what they're looking for, but also have some other stories that frankly are more interesting and more engaging for an interviewer, because if you teach the interviewer something and you bring something to the table that was, wow, I'd never thought of that type of experience connecting in this way to product management, that's fun, that's engaging. If you engage the interviewer and also make your key messages and your points, that's when you can win.